We're going round 2 with taking our wired mechanical 60% keyboard and changing just about every single aspect of it to make it something truly unique. We did accomplish a lot in the last episode, but we still have a ton of modifications to make, so let's go! On the last episode, we completed the custom paint job and managed to struggle through the wireless conversion with all of the components mounted inside of the case. I had been running it flawlessly for a few weeks already in this state and everything was working correctly. If you remember last time, I did have an issue with the connectors that I was sent and I finally got the correct ones that actually fit together. I wasn't even sure at that point if I was going to be adding the connectors back in after all of that wiring that I did, but because the keyboard was working so well for me, I decided I was going to invest some more time into it. I still thought that adding connectors to allow me to completely remove the PCB from the case was a good idea. Sometimes it's good to take a small break from your projects just so you can come back with more motivation. Since these connectors are identical, I wanted to mark one just to make sure I didn't plug them in backwards. I am not a fan of clear switches, so I'm upgrading to the Zealio 65G, which is the V1 version of this switch, and to take them all out, I'm going to be using the Hako 808 solder sucker. Removing soldered switches is not the funnest thing to do, but having this tool makes it a ton easier. But to remove the switches, I first have to take out the LEDs, and sometimes you have to reflow the solder in order to get the solder sucker to work correctly. I'm just doing a quick switch swap just to make sure that this switch is going to work with this board without any issues. And after testing that, it did work, so I'm moving on to taking out all of the LEDs and I'm adding some more solder just to make the job of removing them with the solder sucker a lot easier. This is a relatively expensive tool, but if you're going to be removing a lot of switches, it is worth its weight in gold. There are 61 keys on this board, so that's 61 switches and also 61 LEDs. Each switch and each LED also has a positive and negative pin. That comes out to 244 solder pads that need to be removed. I know it seems like it's going very quickly, but this easily took a few hours to do. But even with all of this work, I still prefer switches that are soldered to the board over hot swap sockets. Now, even using this expensive tool, it will not get all of the components out on the first pass. There's always going to be at least a few components that are very stubborn, and I'm just using some needle nose pliers to remove the rest of the LEDs with gentle pressure because you don't want to crush the LEDs. To get the really tough ones, I'm using this technique of heating from one side while pulling from the other. It's a bit precarious, but it does work. If you have a vise or something else to hold up the board, it can make this job a lot easier. And now I'm just going to continue on with this technique until I have all of the LEDs removed. And after that, it's roughly the same identical process to remove the switches. And also, just like the LEDs, there's still going to be some stubborn switches that don't want to come out on the first pass. And once you have all the switches desoldered, then you can start prying up the little clips that hold them into the plate. And once I finally got those last switches removed, I was able to finally separate the plate from the PCB. And I will just remove the clip-in stabilizers, and then I have plans for this plate after that. Over time, this plate did experience some corrosion in one of the areas, and I wanted to clean that up. I was going to paint this plate a different color, but after sanding off all of the original paint, I thought it might actually look cooler in the raw steel look. If you do some finish sanding in the same direction, the steel can actually look like some brushed aluminum. So that was my plan for this plate, and removing all this paint was very tedious. It was very easy to take off most of the bigger chunks of the paint, but it was more the smaller crevices that were really hard to get to. I probably should have just used a wire wheel or some other automated method for removing this paint, but I just did it the old-fashioned way with some elbow grease. And as you can see in the light, the raw steel with the brush strokes on it actually looks pretty good. Because this is steel, I do not want it to rust on me like it was already previously being corroded. I sealed it all up with some protective clear coat. I did go a little heavy on the clear coat, so the finish is not flawless, but I think it looks pretty good. I'm glad I went with the raw finish instead of painting it because I think it looks a little bit more interesting. And now all we have to do is put it back together. So we're installing the stabilizers, and then the switches actually hold the plate to the PCB. So I'm going to get everything aligned with the corners of the switches in first. You want to be careful when installing not to bend the pins while you're pressing the switches into the PCB. You can see here that one of the pins got bent, but they're very easy to bend back in place. Once we have the 4 corners tied up, we can then start installing the rest of the switches and know that they are going to line up in the holes correctly. Once you have all the switches installed, you can flip it over and just check to see if there's any pins that don't look like they're coming through the through holes. Installing and soldering them back in is much faster than trying to remove them. This process goes much more quickly and is much more enjoyable to do. After soldering up all the switches, I just want to plug the keyboard in and just do a key test and make sure all of the switches are operating correctly. Since we've already made so many modifications, we might as well not stop here, so I'm adding some different colored LEDs other than the plain white that came with it. I'm still going to be using some of the white LEDs, I'm just adding some colors to more of the accent keys. The Pok3r keyboard does have some built-in functions like arrow keys, so I'm making my WASD keys using UV LEDs, and I'm going to be using red LEDs to designate the arrow keys. This will help make it easier to find these keys when you have the backlighting on. Since I am reusing a lot of the white LEDs, they don't have longer leads like the new LEDs do, and although they are a bit trickier to get back in, it's not too bad. As I said before, reinstallation and assembly is much faster and quicker than trying to disassemble everything. And now that we have all of the LEDs installed, let's go ahead and check out how it looks. With our new plate color, LED color, and new switches, I think this is looking really cool. It's quite the departure from the monochromatic style that was previously here. Now that we have successfully completed all of these modifications, let's see how it looks when we put the keycaps back on the keyboard. I'm betting just these LED changes are going to make a pretty big impact on how the keyboard looks. The UV LEDs are coming up more of a bluish tint in the video, so it does seem like it has a red, white, and blue theme, which is not bad, but I think it looks even cooler in person. Looking back now, I think if I had changed all of the white LEDs to the UV purple, I think it would have looked even better, but I am happy with how it looks here. Let me know what you guys think. Is it too busy? Are there too many colors going on? I definitely thought that the colors and the effects when I was filming this looked really cool. Now that everything was looking more and more how I wanted it to look, I decided it would be a good idea to make sure that the pins on the PCB were not going to be even slightly puncturing the battery. To do that, I just trimmed all of the protruding pins and just cut them flush with the PCB. This battery pack is extremely large for this case, and I just wanted to make sure that everything was going to be as safe as possible. After using this keyboard for even a longer amount of time, I did start to see some weird issues going on with what seemed to be affecting the battery. As you can see, the battery meter is flashing 1 bar, which is basically showing that the battery is completely depleted. I know this wasn't the case because this was fully charged overnight. So something was definitely up, and I didn't immediately suspect that it was the battery itself. I first figured maybe it was some of my wiring, maybe one of the relays had gone bad. Almost anything other than suspecting that the battery was just a bad battery. In hindsight, it seems very obvious, but I hadn't ever run into this situation before. The only other times I was getting weird issues was when the wiring was wrong, or maybe a component, either the circuit board or the Bluetooth module, had failed. Those were the only issues I had encountered during my experiences, so I thought the battery was probably just fine. So I tore apart all of my wiring in the hopes of finding out what was causing this problem. To make troubleshooting a lot easier, I wanted to remove as much of the extraneous components that I could. I figured if I simplify everything and it starts to work correctly, then it's one of those components that I removed that is faulty. Since the majority of the time I was using this keyboard wirelessly anyway, I didn't really need to have the wired and wireless switch. And here, with everything simplified, you can see the same battery with all of the LED indicators on. This again confirmed my suspicion that it wasn't actually the battery that was the problem. Now that I had simplified and figured out what the problem was, it was working fine again, so I decided to put it all back together. And while I was doing that, I also ran into some other issues. Every time I would put the PCB back into its spot, the keyboard would basically turn off. I had never seen this issue before, so it was pretty bizarre to me. I did just go through all the wiring, so maybe it had something to do with that. It had to be some connection problem because slight pressure or moving it seemed to turn the keyboard on and off, so it had to be a connection issue somewhere. This area, where I had a ton of wires taped to the PCB, seemed like the most likely place where this was happening. I kept fiddling with it and taping and retaping some of the wires in the hopes that it would work. I'm not really sure why it was acting up now, because I had taken apart this keyboard many times and it never was a problem. I think I finally got it, and then I went to screw it in and then it just turns off. I figured at this point, okay, you're just messing with me. So go ahead, open it again, and we'll see if we can make it work. And then as soon as I open it, it turns back on. You can see the LEDs coming on again. This keyboard was seriously just toying with my sanity here. But I know if I can get it to not work, then I should be able to figure out how to get it to work. And I was very confident that it had to do with those wires that I had taped to the PCB. So after messing with it a lot more and trying to figure it out, I finally got it. I don't know exactly which wire it was, but I moved some things around and then I got it to consistently work, so whatever it was, it must have been one of those power wires just maybe pressing on one of the pins, or I don't know what it was, but I got it to work, which it did for about another week or so. And then I finally realized what the actual problem was, and that's that this battery was a dead battery. And to test that, I wanted to just completely isolate the battery, so I'm connecting up a different charge circuit and even plugging in a completely different keyboard altogether. I knew it was bad because my USB meter would not reset. Usually this will only flash for about 5 seconds, but it was just indefinitely flashing and it would not accept a charge. Okay, now fast forward another few weeks, I installed another battery off camera, which I was not happy with, but I'll get into that later. What I wanted to modify now was to change the paint job. As you know from the previous episode, I wasn't super happy with this paint job to begin with. I don't know if it was a combination of the red color or the fact that I was just a little more loose than I usually am. It had just been slightly bothering me, so I wanted to change it up. Because I was so happy with how the raw steel looked on the plate when we scraped all the paint off of that, I figured it also might look cool if we just have a raw aluminum color for the casing. This would be quite the departure from the paint job that I had applied on it previously, with a much more subdued and cleaner look. Hey, what are you up to? Oh, you know, just sitting in the mud scraping paint off of a keyboard case. What do you guys do with your free time? Seriously, this was a lot of work though. I really do need to get some wire wheels. at the very least to knock off the big chunks, and then I could just clean up with some sandpaper after that. But I decided to do the whole thing just by hand with sandpaper. It was looking really cool though. I really like the raw aluminum look. It has a very industrial feel and I just think it looks pretty good. After getting as much of the paint off as I could, I cleaned it up with some 800 grit. I couldn't get every single little crevice, so instead of getting extra tedious with the Dremel, I decided I would just paint those parts that I couldn't get with the sandpaper. These are almost entirely on the bottom of the keyboard, so I felt like this was the faster and better solution. It also would offer some black contrasting color to the silver metallic. And even though this is aluminum and probably would be totally fine without any kind of protective finish, I just wanted to give it a clear coat as well. I think the black actually looks pretty good. Now, because I realized that it was actually my battery that was causing all of my problems before, I figured I could reinstall my wired to wireless relays back into the circuit, and I could also clean up the wiring even more. It's not perfect nor beautiful, but it is very functional. After removing the rubber feet pads so many times they had lost their stick, so I needed to add some extra glue to them. Okay, so my first battery died. The second battery I got was way too small, so I did buy a brand new battery for the keyboard. I also got tired of replacing the batteries in my caliper, so I decided to mod those as well. This battery is going to last a very long time. This new battery is actually a little bit thinner than the original battery I had in there. It's slightly wider, but it is about 2 millimeters thinner, and that is going to make it fit even better into the case, all while retaining just about the same capacity. This replacement battery that I had in the interim only had about 900 milliamp hours, which is roughly about 1/3 of the capacity. It did fit in the case very easily because of how much smaller it was. But I didn't mod this case to put a tiny battery in here. Right there it says 3220 milliampere hours. That is absolutely ridiculous. That battery only got maybe 1200 on the best day. This new battery is about 2700 milliamp hour, and that is going to last a lot longer. And now that the keyboard is fully functional once again, I decided it had earned a special keycap set. With the case now looking very clean and minimal, I decided to contrast that with some over-the-top keycaps. So let's throw them on and see what it looks like. This is a custom printed Cyberpunk themed keycap set. These keycaps are totally wild, but I do think that it fits with the overall aesthetics of this build. They are not shine through keycaps, but I still think they look really cool on a backlit keyboard. Check it out. What do you guys think of this overall build? With the build nearly completed, there was one last thing that was bothering me about it, and that was the space on the bottom of the keyboard. I've been really into gold lately, so I wanted to try this out and see how it looked. I was a bit hesitant to how the gold was going to come out, so I made a more subdued one in carbon fiber as well. Another cool thing about laser cutters is you can make your own vinyl stickers. I thought an HTLL logo would be a perfect finishing touch to this build. I think the gold accent on the black with the silver surround just actually looks really cool. It still fits with the metallic industrial look, but it just has that little extra. Even though a lot of emphasis was placed on the aesthetics, it is still a very functional wired and wireless keyboard. This project started off more as just an experiment to see if I could even make it work, but it has evolved and transformed into something that I think is really cool. It has been quite the transformation from just a regular wired keyboard to what we have here. Let me know what you guys think. Do you love it? Do you hate it? And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. We're going back in time to show you my first ever e-bike build. It's a custom 18 kilowatt mid-drive super cruiser. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.